All Indiana Politics is your premier source for Indiana politics, focusing on issues that matter to you.
I still want us to be the best in the Midwest.
We can't afford another lockdown.
Give the citizens of this country the relief they need.
Education in the state of Indiana remains priority number one.
In-depth, nonpartisan coverage.
We don't know exactly where the economy will be in January.
People are worried with good reason.
Exclusive interviews with Indiana's political leaders.
We have the resources here in the state of Indiana to care for those who are in need.
Expert analysis on critical legislation.
We need to reform those laws.
This recovery is going to take some time.
We've got to anticipate that there'll be a budget shortfall.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
I'm Garrett Bergquist, government reporter for Wish TV and the producer of All Indiana Politics. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris aren't the only names Hoosier voters will see on their presidential ballots this fall. Chase Oliver is carrying the Libertarian Party's banner this year. Oliver is from Atlanta, Georgia. He's 39 years old and got his start in politics protesting against the Iraq War. He ran for Senate in Georgia 2 years ago and is widely credited with forcing a runoff between Raphael, Warnock, and Herschel there. Oliver visited Indianapolis on September 10th and 11th. He stopped by our studios between campaign events. Joining us now is the Libertarian candidate for President of the United States, Chase Oliver. Chase, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you for having me. I look forward to speaking with you and speaking to your audience today.
So why are you running for president?
Well, I honestly think that America deserves more than two choices from a failed two-party system. I don't fit into the political binary, and I know a lot of voters don't as well. We in the Libertarian Party are the third largest political party in the United States, and we want to win. We want to be able to grow ourselves to be a contender to the two-party system and inject at least a third voice into the system and hopefully break it open so that we can have many more voices being represented across the spectrum.
For our viewers who aren't familiar, explain in a nutshell what the Libertarian Party stands for.
So we stand for minimal government intrusion into your lives. We believe that, if you're not harming anyone, you should be able to control your own life, the way you handle your business, the way you handle your personal life without the government intervening. Unless you're committing violence or fraud or force against another person, there really is no reason for the government to intervene in your day-to-day decisions. And so in a nutshell, I say, if you're not harming anyone, your life should be your life, your body should be your body, your business should be your business, and your property should be your property, not mine and not the federal government's.
One of the big issues that's come up in Indiana is the cost of housing, and that's certainly not unique to our state. There are, of course, some federal programs dealing with housing, such as Section 8. At the federal level, what would an Oliver administration do to help people find affordable housing?
Honestly, I think what we need to do as much as possible is disengage the federal government from that, from the housing market altogether and rely on free market practices. But to do that, we have to use the power of the bully pulpit to actually break down housing regulations and zoning regulations in cities and states all across this country. I want to see, high-density housing being built in cities where it's needed. The biggest impediment to that is the NIMBY liberal, the person who says, not in my backyard. Hey, we need the housing somewhere, but just not close to me because it'll affect my property values or affect my day-to-day. I think we need to remove the barriers to creating new housing, and I don't think the federal government has a hand necessarily in building new homes. Just the same as with government doesn't create jobs. Politicians say, I created X number of jobs. They also don't build homes. Home builders build homes, businesses build homes, and we need to create the conditions that make it more affordable to actually build. And a lot of that is getting the cost of goods down. If plywood is costing 4 times more than it did a few years back, it's going to cost more expensive for all the materials to build a house. So we need to get costs under control first and foremost.
You've called for simplifying the immigration process. What would that look like in practice? What specifically would you like to do there?
Well, I call our platform a 21st century Ellis Island. The reason being is that 40% of Americans can trace a relative that came to this country through Ellis Island in the 19th and 20th centuries during the last great migration wave. And during that time, folks came to our shores, they declared who they were, went through a health check, and if everything was good to go, they were allowed to come into this country. And so that is what we need to be doing at our southern border, is streamlining the process. If you want to come here to this country to work, come declare who you are, to a background check, to a health check, and then if you're good to go, be given a visa to get to work and let the market dictate where labor needs to go and where the jobs are. The mess that we have at our southern border is because of the red tape and bureaucracy and just complete failures of the government to address the needs of labor in this country. Immigrants build jobs, they create prosperity, and they add to the economic pie. And so I think it's a good thing if we can process people as quickly and streamline that as much as possible.
What about those crossing illegally? And for that matter, what would you do about the flow of drugs, especially fentanyl, across the southern border?
So I think if you had a streamlined process where people could come here and declare who they are to be able to get a job or to be able to get status to work, you would see far less people actually trying to illegally come through the border. And we could actually laser focus our law enforcement on those who would still be trying to do that. Because if they are, there's a good chance they're doing it for the purposes of, human trafficking, for the purposes of labor or sexual exploitation, or as you said, bringing fentanyl across our border. Now, I'm a libertarian. I want to see the end of the drug war overall. I believe in decriminalizing all drugs. But I think what we're seeing at our southern border is a case of fraud, where fentanyl is being made to look like Xanax or other drugs, and people are taking these drugs thinking it's one thing and it's another, and that's what's causing the overdose. And so if we ended the war on drugs, you could actually see your drugs be tested at a pharmacy. They do that in Portugal, where they've decriminalized drugs, and you would see far less overdoses because you would see more safe usage. And that's one way to address the addiction crisis in this country from a harm reduction standpoint.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. And ending the war on drugs has long been a Libertarian Party goal. What are some other things that you would do to address the fentanyl crisis?
Well, as I said, what we are seeing here is a case of fraud. Most people who are overdosing on fentanyl don't know they're taking fentanyl. And so if you had a decriminalized world where you could properly test your product, you would have higher you would have higher quality, I would hate to say, higher quality drugs that are less likely to be cut with fentanyl. You would have more awareness for a user to know what they're taking, and you would create less stigma for those who are maybe wanting to suss out, what it is that they might be ingesting to their body. And so this is something that would save lives. I've seen it actually happen, harm reduction strategies where you pass out fentanyl testing strips, Narcan, and other things at the community level to help prevent the worst cases of overdose. But at the end of the day, if fentanyl was legal, I don't think you're going to use it. I don't think I'm going to use it. As long as we know what we're ingesting in our body, I think that's what we really need when it comes to drug use and drug awareness, especially when you're handling the crisis of addiction, which should be a medical issue, not a criminal justice one where we're throwing people in jail.
You've said that we should end restrictions on abortions before viability, and that's the exact wording on your website. Would you push for a federal law to that end?
Yes, I believe that body autonomy and medical privacy should allow an individual to make that choice for themselves. And it should be determined by the most local government possible, which is your own self-governance. But we have to have the conditions to protect people's privacy rights and medical freedom to allow them to make that very difficult decision. And I'm not going to want to make that decision for anyone. I don't think any government bureaucrat should be making that decision up to the point of viability. And post-viability, in those very rare instances, it should be a doctor that determines whether the health or life of the mother is at risk, not a government board who has to investigate these things. I just think that that is the place for that kind of decision making, that there's no room for government in that very, very private choice that you should be allowed to have.
And I just want to be clear here, so you would push for a federal law legalizing abortion and overriding state-level bans such as the one we have here in Indiana?
Yes, if there was if the standard of Roe v. Wade and Casey were brought to a bill by Congress to my desk, I would sign it, because I do believe all people deserve that body autonomy. I do want to say this, though. There are things that we can do with the pro-life community to actually reduce the number of abortions in this country and partner with them in that. Things like not legalizing, but making birth control over the counter so it's easier to access that contraception. Removing the red tapes and barriers around adoption so more people choose to become adoptive parents, so surrogacy becomes a more viable option instead of terminating a pregnancy. So there are things we can certainly do in this country, partnering pro-life and pro-choice community together to prevent unwanted pregnancies to begin with.
We just had another school shooting last week in your home state of Georgia. We talked about that a little bit as we were coming into the room here. 4 people died, 2 of them students. How would you address the mass shooting problem in the United States? How would you prevent future school shootings?
Well, I think the rush to gun control argument is one that I don't really see as viable, because we've always had guns in this country, but we haven't always had mass shootings. And we need to examine what has changed in our society basically since Columbine moving forward, that has had the propensity for school shootings to be growing in this country. I think the first thing we need to look at is the dehumanization and the rise of social media, where people can jump on social media platforms. You can say all sorts of things to dehumanize. It removes that human element from your interaction with folks. And of course, if you're a lonely person who's depressed or is suffering from anxiety, it's very easy to find wells of extremism in social media. So parents need to be more responsible for understanding what their kids are consuming online. I think that's the first barrier to preventing these tragedies from happening. The second thing we need to look at is the rise of psychotropic drug use in these young men who are feeling extremely lonely, and understand maybe there's a connection there. But what we can do to protect our students is harden the target. Make it harder for someone to be able to get into a school. With new schools being constructed, we need to look at what logistically we can do to create barriers for someone who might want to do harm. And of course, we need to remove the attraction of gun-free zones. I think having, if teachers want to be armed and want to go through some sort of certification, or registration with the school to show that they can safely operate a firearm, they should be allowed to do that. And that can be a deterrent from anyone attacking a school, knowing that there might be both teachers and resource officers who are ready and willing to defend their students.
You brought up the issue of social media, but we have social media in other countries, and other countries don't have the level of mass shootings we have here.
Well, I think part of that is culturally, we have also looked at this entire generation of lonely young men, and I think we are over-medicating the solution there. I think a lot of that has to do with identifying the mental health issues that are going through these. And when I say young men, that's because that's the highest propensity of these shooters. We need to be examining what we can do to address the mental health crises before it gets to the point of violence. And I do also think in the case of Appalachia, we need to look at the responsibility of parents who have been warned that their child has violent ideations and yet still provide them firearms that they're easily accessible to. And we're seeing that play out in the Appalachia High School case. And I want to say this hits very close to home to me. I have a nephew who lives in Winder, who goes to the school across town, who knows people who have been victims in this shooting. And so, I care about the safety of our young people because it hits very close to home. I do think the rush to gun control is kind of a knee-jerk reaction when I think there are other factors that contribute to school violence.
Let's turn to foreign policy. Would you end American military aid to Ukraine?
Yes, I would end United States military aid across the board as much as possible. I think if there is a need for more military aid to Ukraine, Western Europe can take the lead there as we examine what we can do from a humanitarian point of view to alleviate the suffering in Ukraine. I would like to see more private organizations be able to sponsor refugees to come to the United States and settle until the war is over. And ultimately, I believe conscription, being forced to fight in a military, is wrong, and that is a great reason to be able to claim asylum. And I would tell the Russian military, many of whom are conscripts who don't want to fight and die in Ukraine, that if they lay down their arms and declare themselves, we will provide them amnesty to come to the United States, because I don't believe you should have to fight in a war that Putin's forcing you to fight if you would rather live in peace.
What about aid to Israel?
Aid to Israel, I believe in removing all military aid. I think we need to shift our foreign policy to one that's more based in diplomacy, free trade, and voluntary exchange. But Israel had a right to respond to October 7th. I think if that had happened in Indianapolis, we would be demanding a response from our own government here at home if such an attack were to happen to us. I think the manner in which Israel has responded to that attack has been so heavy-handed in the terms of lives lost, casualties, tens of thousands of innocent people, billions of dollars of infrastructure destroyed that's going to have to be rebuilt for the Palestinian people. I think that is what has turned much of the goodwill of the world against Israel, and that's not a result of the Israeli people, many of whom want to see peace and a ceasefire as well. It's a result of their government. And I'd like to remind people that when I have criticism of Israel, it is towards the Netanyahu government, not the people of Israel, just as my criticism of Hamas is not towards the Palestinian people. If I criticize people for the actions of their government, I would have to criticize Americans quite a bit. And so I recognize that the peace process is not going to be coming from the Netanyahu government or Hamas. It's going to be coming from Palestinians and Israelis changing their leadership and demanding a peaceful move forward. I would like to see that going, but I don't think we're going to see those conditions until we see both a ceasefire plan and a release of the hostages, which I call for regularly.
So what happens if Russia or Iran move in to fill the power vacuum left behind? Putin has already demonstrated that he will never be satisfied with just one more piece of territory.
Well, I don't see Putin moving westward more into Europe, honestly. I do think that the best way for us to have spheres of influence around the world are not to do that with diplomacy that is done at the barrel of a gun or with the drone or the bomb. I think our diplomacy needs to be one that's trusted in mutual respect for our international neighbors. And I think we could actually foster more goodwill in many places around the world that have been actually hostile to us because of our militarization, because we have bases all over the world, because we kind of view ourselves as the world's policemen. I think if we shifted our foreign policy to one that's more based in mutual respect for our international neighbors, we could still have, great relations around the world and be able to still have, great influence around the world. The United States culture is what tore down the Berlin Wall. It's what tore down the Iron Curtain. It wasn't just Reagan saying tear down the wall. It was Wrangler jeans and rock and roll and Coca-Cola and McDonald's. And I think our culture still is the most exported around the world, and we still have the most influence around the world, even if we don't do it with militarization.
Our national debt is now at $35 trillion with a T and still climbing. What's your plan to bring it down?
Well, I think that's actually the most important thing that we need to be addressing as candidates for president is what are we going to do to address the debt and deficit? I believe in balancing the federal budget immediately. I would challenge Congress to submit me a balanced budget if I were elected president. If it's not balanced, it will be vetoed, and Congress would have to override because I don't want to add one more dollar of debt and deficit to our kids and grandkids. And I believe in challenging Congress to meet that as those, it is their job to hold the purse strings, but that would involve lots of slashing, redundancies, a huge amount of Pentagon cuts. You'd have to address the entitlement spending. There would really be nothing left off the table in terms of what we need to cut so that we can make ourselves a balanced budget, because the highest driver of inflation is that debt and deficit. It's the printing of trillions of dollars a year out of thin air. And that's what is most affecting households each and every month when they look at the bills, when they're trying to make ends meet and they see themselves stretching paycheck to paycheck. The best thing we can do is get our fiscal house in order as a government so that way we can create more prosperity in the future for families across the country.
Now, here in Indiana, we just had about 1,600 medically complex children who were removed from the Medicaid attendant care program. That was part of an effort to close about $1 billion funding gap in Medicaid here in the state of Indiana. That's led to some very, very significant hardship on the part of those families. How would you head off those kinds of effects writ large if you were to impose massive spending cuts nationwide?
Well, there's two things I want to say. First, I think much of what the federal government does should be left to the states or local governments. Per the 9th and 10th Amendment, those are the, that's the constitutional role of much of what we would cut out of the federal government. That would be block granted back to the states to have to maintain and handle. But there will be pain. I don't want to be a liar. There will be pain as we transition ourselves to a more balanced budget and remove ourselves from the entitlement trap that we've been in since before I was born. There would have been less pain if we had done this 20 years ago, and there will be more pain if we do it 20 years from now. And as a millennial who sees the car going off the cliff, I'm trying to steer ourselves away, even if it causes some discomfort. And I recognize that no plan is perfect, but this is the best way to remove ourselves away from being dependent on the government and continuing to see rising costs because of that. And so, I recognize that there will be pain in this process, but that's also being honest in a way that Republicans and Democrats never have been when it comes to entitlement spending. But the way we're going to address that in our communities is through charity and through us taking care of our communities at the local level. One of the biggest things I want to get across as libertarians, just because we don't think the government should do something doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It just means that we think that the government is one of the more inefficient and terrible ways of doing those things. And it can be much better facilitated through local community action to care for our neighbors, to care for our friends, to care for our loved ones. And that would be what would eventually fill in the gap as we see some of these pain points created. That's what would fill in the gap and ultimately alleviate those pain points.
What's one issue we haven't talked about that you believe is not getting enough attention in this election?
Well, I do think that both the Democrats and Republicans, we were just talking about deficit spending and inflation, I do think that both of them really do ignore this, or at best pay lip service, such as Donald Trump when he said he was going to cut the debt in half in 8 years, and then he ran up more deficit spending in 4 than any other president had in a 4-year term. So I think that's one of the things that just isn't being talked about by the quote-unquote mainline candidates, and because of that, the media is kind of ignoring that as well. I think there's a lot of other issues when it comes to things like federal invasions of our privacy, these post 9/11 legislation that is still existing on the books. We're doing this interview on the 11th of September, I know it's going to air later, but it's kind of in the front of my mind right now, thinking about how the world has changed since 9/11, 2001. And much of that has come from federal policy that has invaded our privacy, invaded our free speech, things like warrantless wiretapping, the Patriot Act. Those are things that still don't get talked about, that we still need to remove ourselves from. But I think we've been through like 3 crises since then, so oftentimes it's just not in the forefront of the American voter's mind. And I hope libertarians can maybe bring that back to the forefront.
For a lot of voters this fall, the thing that is most paramount to them is keeping either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris out of the White House. What do you say to people who might look at you and say, well, if I vote for this guy, all I'm doing is ensuring that whichever of those two I dislike more goes into the Oval Office?
Well, there's a great solution to that. If you convince enough of your friends and neighbors to vote for me, you can actually keep both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris out of the White House. But absent that, what I tell people is, I am not here to spoil something, because the two-party system is already spoiled rotten. If you look at the congressional approval ratings, regularly under 20%, yet the incumbent re-election rate regularly over 90%, that tells you this system is broken, that people are dissatisfied, but they're not able to see the change they want to see. And so the only way to make that change happen is to help a third party grow, to help create more prominence for us, to help us win ballot access or major party status across this country, and to help create something that will challenge this two-party system and tear it down piece by piece. The only way to do that is to vote differently. And when you do that, another thing happens. Democrats and Republicans really start paying attention to you, because if you get the 5, 10, 20%, they're going to really say, okay, what can we do to earn those votes back? And so even if we don't end up winning, we win when they steal our best ideas and put them forward.
Chase Oliver, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Chase Oliver, Libertarian candidate for President of the United States. Remember, you can catch All Indiana Politics every Sunday morning at 9:30, only on Wish TV. I'm Garrett Bergquist. Thanks for listening.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network. Watch All Indiana Politics live Sunday mornings at 9:30 on Wish TV and at wishtv.com. Subscribe to this podcast and listen weekly here on the All Indiana Podcast Network. And be sure to discover even more great podcasts at allindianapodcastnetwork.com.